1915 began with a question that haunted every general staff in Europe. How do we break the line? The optimism of 1914 was gone. In its place was a 450-mile scar of earth where millions of men lived in holes in the ground. The war of movement has failed. Now, the great powers began a desperate search for a new way to win. Through science, through new allies, and through sheer industrial-scale slaughter. Let's revisit history. In April, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the world saw a new kind of horror. German pioneers opened 5,000 cylinders of chlorine gas. A greenish-yellow cloud drifted toward the French and Canadian lines. Men who breathed it felt their lungs turn to liquid. It was a war crime that changed the nature of combat forever. Soldiers were forced to cover their faces with rags soaked in urine just to survive until the first primitive mass arrived. With the Western Front stuck, Britain's Winston Churchill proposed a daring shortcut. Attack the soft underbelly of the Central Powers. On April 25th, Allied troops, including the Anzacs from Australia and New Zealand, landed at Gallipoli. The goal was to seize the Dardanelles and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. Instead, they found themselves clinging to cliffs under fire from Ottoman troops led by Mustafa Kemal. It became a 10-month nightmare of heat, disease, and futility. In the east, the Russian steamroller was failing. Germany launched the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive, forcing Russia into a great retreat that cost them over 1 million men. Meanwhile, a new front opened in the south. Italy, tempted by promises of land, betrayed the Triple Alliance and joined the Allies. But the Alpine front was a vertical hell. Soldiers fought in the freezing Italian Alps, where avalanches killed almost as many men as the machine guns did. By mid-1915, the war was consuming more than just lives. It was consuming metal. Britain faced a shell crisis. They simply couldn't manufacture artillery shells fast enough. Governments took control of factories, and for the first time, women entered the workforce in massive numbers to build the machines of death. The entire world was now an arsenal. But as the year ended, the lines hadn't moved. The stage was set for the even bloodier year of 1916. February 1916. Germany launches Operation Gericht, the place of execution. The target was Verdun, a city of immense French pride. German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn didn't want to capture the city. He wanted to bleed France white by forcing them to defend it at all costs. For 300 days, the hills around Verdun became a moonscape of craters and bones. It was the longest battle in history. To save France from collapse at Verdun, the British launched a massive diversion, the Battle of the Somme. On July 1st, after a week of artillery fire, British soldiers climbed out of their trenches, convinced no German could have survived. They were wrong. In just 24 hours, the British Army suffered 60,000 casualties. It remains the darkest day in British military history. Amidst the slaughter of the Somme, a secret weapon finally crawled onto the field. On September 15th, the world saw its first tank, the British Mark I. They were loud, slow, and broke down constantly, but when they worked, they were terrifying. They could crush barbed wire and cross trenches that had stopped men for years. The age of mechanized warfare had been born in the mud. While the West was locked in a stalemate, the East saw a final spark of Russian brilliance. General Alexei Brusilov launched a massive, innovative offensive that nearly shattered the Austro-Hungarian army. It was Russia's greatest victory, but the cost was staggering. Russia lost its last professional soldiers, leaving the army filled with exhausted peasants. The seeds of the coming revolution were being sown in the blood of 1916. By the end of 1916, the casualty lists were beyond comprehension. Millions were gone, but the lines on the map had moved less than 10 miles in either direction. The world was exhausted, but the leaders were doubling down. Next, we look at the war where no man could hide, the sea and the sky. While the armies were stuck in the mud, Germany turned to the depths. Desperate to break the British naval blockade that was starving their people, they unleashed the U-boat. In May 1915, the world was shocked when a German submarine sank the RMS Lusitania, a British luxury liner. Over 1,100 people died, including 128 Americans. It was a diplomatic disaster for Germany and the first major step toward bringing the United States into the war. In May 1916, the two greatest fleets on Earth finally met in the Battle of Jutland. Over 250 ships clashed in the North Sea. It was a chaotic mess of smoke, steel, and massive explosions. Germany technically sank more ships, but they couldn't break the British wall of steel. The German surface fleet retreated to port and stayed there for the rest of the war, leaving the U-boats as their only weapon at sea. In the skies, the war was evolving at terrifying speed. Planes that started the war as simple scouting tools were now deadly weapons. In 1915, Germany introduced the Fokker Eindecker, the first plane with a synchronization gear that allowed a machine gun to fire through the propeller without hitting the blades. For months, German pilots dominated the sky. This was the era of the first aces, knights of the air, who fought individual duels thousands of feet above the trenches. Men like the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, became household names. But the glamour of the air was a mask for a brutal reality. A pilot's life expectancy was often measured in weeks. Without parachutes, their only options were to go down with their burning machine or jump. As 1916 drew to a close, the air war was no longer a sport. It was a sophisticated, deadly wing of the industrial war machine. As 1916 drew to a close, the sheer math of the war was becoming impossible. At Verdun and the Somme alone, combined casualties had surpassed 2 million. Behind the lines, the total war was hitting home. In Germany, the British blockade meant the turnip winter had begun. Starving civilians were forced to eat fodder meant for livestock. The glory of the empire was being traded for a bowl of watery soup. In the east, the Russian Empire was vibrating with tension. The Brusilov offensive had been a victory on paper, but a death blow to the Tsar's authority. Millions of peasant soldiers were deserting, and back in Petrograd, bread riots were turning into calls for revolution. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for 300 years, was months away from total collapse. The Eastern Front was about to implode. While millions died for a few miles of mud in France, diplomats in backrooms were already carving up the spoils. In 1916, Britain and France signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It was a secret deal to divide the Middle East into zones of influence once the Ottoman Empire fell. These lines on a map, drawn with a ruler in a London office, would create borders that still spark conflict to this very day. Germany knew they couldn't win a long war of attrition. They were being strangled. To win, they decided on a final, desperate gamble: unrestricted submarine warfare. They would sink every ship, neutral or not, headed for Britain. They knew this would likely bring the United States into the war, but they bet they could starve Britain into surrendering before the Americans could arrive. It was a race against time. The world of 1914 was gone. The world of 1917 would be one of revolutions, American intervention, and the final, agonizing push for peace. The stalemate was about to break. Thank you for revisiting history.